So if you're walking, as you walk, you notice the soles of your feet. You pay attention to the heel touching into the ground, the center of the foot touching into the ground, the toes touching into the ground. And as each part of your foot touches into the ground, just taking a pause as you're walking to go get a snack to notice that, that can really take the attention and the emotions and the nerves from here all the way down. As we're eating, how many of us eat while we're like messaging someone and watching TV and talking to our spouse on the phone? Like, we do all those things at the same time. How about just taking a moment to pause, noticing the flavors of our food, noticing the texture, really actually being present with what we're having. And then on top of that, we have actual meditation. So there's so many different types of meditation. Everything from focusing on the breath, noticing it enter the body and leave. Visualization, imagining that we're in a relaxing beach scene like Michelle is in our Zoom today. Noting, like we mentioned last time, I noticed that I feel angry. I just noticed that, and then I let it pass, right? There's so many different types of mindfulness that are available to us. I have some resources actually I can share that are great and free after this call. So we'll try one of those. So take a moment to close your eyes really briefly. And let your breathing go. And notice the breath as it enters the nostrils. During its normal process, just noticing it enter the body. Notice it leaving the body. Without trying to control or change anything, see if you can just be aware. Maybe noticing the nostrils expand on the inhale, noticing them contract on the exhale. And then opening your eyes and coming back into the room. So that's a really quick way that we can do a little bit of meditation in a moment. You can do that while you're, brushing your teeth. You can do that while you're taking a shower. You can do that as you're walking to go get your food, things like that. One other thing I wanted to share with you all is there's a really great breath that I absolutely love. It's really awesome for banishing stress. It's really well touted by Dr. Andrew Weil, who's a Harvard MD and focusing on integrative medicine. And it's a breath with a cadence of 4-7-8. I found this to be really powerful. I teach this most weeks with my students in my meditation classes, and I'll share it with you today. So the way you do it is that you'll place the tip of your tongue just behind your upper front teeth in your mouth. Don't judge me, I'm going to look a little silly, but you basically take your tongue, put it underneath your front teeth, and just purse your lips a little bit like so. And as you're exhaling, you're going to make a little bit of a whooshing sound out of your mouth. And you're going to inhale through the nose. So the way this will go, I'll tell you, and then we'll try it. You'll breathe in through the nose for 4. You'll hold for 7, and then you'll breathe out of the mouth with the tongue behind the teeth and with the pursed lips in that whooshing sound for 8, like so. You can do this 2 to 4 times. You may speed up the cadence of the 4-7-8 if that's easier. Sometimes breathing out for 8 is a little hard for folks. So we'll try. Are you all ready? Thumbs up if you are. Awesome. Yay. Okay. So you can close your eyes if you feel comfortable. Just take a couple deep breaths, your own pace. And as you're exhaling, see if you can really just let go of anything that may be on your mind, anything that may be preventing you from fully focusing right now. Just let yourself to completely relax. Breathing in through the nose for 4, 3, 2, and hold. Holding, continue holding. Out through the lips for 8. In through the nose for 4, 3, 2, and hold. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. And out through the mouth for 8. And last in breath for the count of 4, 3, 2, and hold for 7. And a long out breath for the count of 8. All right. And how do you feel? Awesome. A little bit more relaxed, right? So that takes, 15 seconds? It's pretty quick. You can do that anytime. That's a great way when you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed to bring the attention down. Like we said, stress weakens the immune system. No one wants their immune system weakened right now. It's so important with everything that we have going on as Black people and as human beings in a COVID world, just to do a little bit of something to take care of ourselves and to nurture our nervous system. The last thing I'll say is it's really great to make a plan to de-stress. So Dr. Stuart Lustig, who I work with in my role, who I brought into Visa to talk about this topic, has come up with a really great structure for how to plan to de-stress. He's the senior medical director of Behavioral Health at Cigna. And so what he came up with is making a plan. So a period of time to de-stress. So that could be waking up a little bit earlier instead of grabbing the phone right when we wake up. Maybe, taking a moment to do something you enjoy, maybe right before bed. A location, where can you go? For those of us who can't go anywhere, is there like a special chair you really love in your home that really signals just like relaxation for you? Is there, like a view or a picture, a painting that you can sit and look at? Do you have a porch or a backyard? Is there an activity you can do? Many of us as Black people, we're really colorful folks. We love to, do our hair or, paint our nails or like try a new fashion. We could read our Bibles, pray, do some dancing, maybe go for a walk, even if it's just in the backyard. Write down a few things you're grateful for. And then the last is the name, someone you can talk to. Is that a pastor? Is it a friend? Is it a therapist? Which therapy is so wonderful all the time, but especially now. Is it a colleague, a mentor, or your family? And so with this little plan, you can just like write yourself a little plan for yourself. Every day, what can you do, maybe just for 5-10 minutes to de-stress, to plan to take care of yourself. So that is the bulk of what I had to share. Thank you so much for your time. I'm not sure if we're doing questions, but if you'd like to, you can ask me in the chat and I will answer them.
We'll come back for questions, but I thank you for your presentation, Lonnie, and hold on, we're going to come back to you. I want to introduce Dr. Keith Ferdinand, who at this point in his career is in Atlanta, Georgia, I believe, and I heard Keith, he was in New Orleans. Dr. Keith Ferdinand was a world-class and recognized cardiovascular specialist. And he was going to speak to us about cardiovascular and cardiac issues. Dr. Ferdinand.
Okay, first thing I need to do is make sure you can hear me. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. So, COVID-19 is real. It's a pandemic. If you look historically, there are big books that are written, Why did the Roman Empire fall? What happened to the Aztecs? And whole history classes are done on that along with papers. And one of the things that has now come to pass is that civilizations have been destroyed by infections. And we all know in the United States, even the Native Americans were heavily damaged, not only by firearms, but also by smallpox brought in by the Europeans. So it's real. Now, specifically as it relates to the cardiovascular system, it is named after a respiratory distress syndrome. That's what SARS means, severe acute respiratory distress syndrome. But we now recognize that perhaps anywhere from 30 to 40% of the deaths are not from simple respiratory failure, but from cardiovascular conditions. You can get thrombosis. That's why you see the younger people with strokes and heart attacks. You can get a myocarditis, similar to what you can see with other viral infections. And indeed, it's probably related to the inflammatory response where the virus causes rupture of atherosclerotic plaques and clots throughout the vascular system. The question that comes into mind is why do African Americans have a higher degree of COVID-19 infections and mortality? And the answer is very complex. We know the underlying risk factors are higher: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, chronic kidney disease. All of these make a COVID-19 situation worse. But it's not simply that. There are some social determinants, some constructions that are related to the increase in infections and mortality. And Dr. Randall actually pointed that out in his opening remarks, that is many of the so-called essential workers, which I find to be a funny term because these were throwaway workers throughout much of our history. Now they're called essential. Can't work from home, can't take off for 2 months. So they're going to be exposed. Grocery clerks, transit operators, delivery persons, they're going to be exposed to the virus. That's going to increase infectivity. The other situation that comes into play is not having an identifiable source of primary care, either not having insurance or being underinsured. So when do you find out that you have a condition? When you're very sick, and then you go to the emergency room, often in the throes of a condition which, having been treated earlier, may not have the same degree of mortality. And then finally, there's real bias in the system. We know bias is real. I'm at Tulane University in New Orleans by choice. I'm a native of New Orleans, a child of the Lower Ninth Ward. But I'm at an academic institution which in 1851, one of the leading papers that came out of Tulane talked about drapetomania. And those of you who are medical historians should know that drapetomania was a disease that white doctors gave to Africans because they wanted to flee slavery. And there was actually a prescribed treatment for drapetomania, and that treatment was whipping the hell out of them. So we know it's a combination of factors, underlying comorbid conditions, being not able to socially distance, and then bias in the system, especially those persons who don't have an identifiable source of primary care, non-insurance or underinsurance, seeking care at the terminal stages of their condition. And I'll make one remark as that relates to cardiovascular disease. We know about the increased rates in hypertension, increased rates in chronic kidney disease, increased rates in heart failure, premature myocardial infarction, increase in strokes. All of those cannot be genetic based. Although there may be some genes in an individual's susceptibility to a condition, it doesn't make sense that such a diverse, broad disparity in outcomes can be caused by one gene or one set of genes. So I think those social determinants, we have to look at that as a clear explanation for some of the differences that we see in terms of COVID-19. There was a question that Dr. Randall Maxey asked me to address, and the question was, how can we actually decrease some of the risk that we see related to COVID-19? And he's already also described that it enters the body through the respiratory tract, but it also can come through the eyes. So if you're working in an environment or you're exposed to clients who have potential infection, you should wear glasses or goggles because coming through the eyes gives a direct path to the central nervous system. That systemic dissemination of the virus with the vascular and the myocarditis is a problem. The United States is not doing a good job keeping statistics. There's an article that some of you are going to see today that the Trump administration actually is not making an effort to document race, ethnicity. So much of our data comes from states, and it's a diverse geographic part of states. I'm here in Louisiana, where there's clearly a disparity, but you also see in the Chicago area, looking in the blue, the percentage of population, and in the red, the share of the deaths. One point that I would like to drive home is that it's not just the numbers of persons, but here you have a density of those who are mortality rate of 100,000. What that means is when you look at the Black community, everybody knows somebody who died. I had a childhood friend who died here in New Orleans. A member of my extended family has died. So it's not just numbers, it's the misery and the great sense of loss and a sense of being under siege that makes the COVID-19 situation even worse. Here are those risk factors that I mentioned. You can see African Americans have higher rates than the whites, but it's not enough to explain the great increase that we see in mortality, which can be anywhere, depending on where you are, it could be 1.5, 2, or even 3 times in the population. Those risk factors are not 3 times when you compare African Americans and white. So it's not simply a wider degree of risk factors. You should go to the National Geographic. It's publicly available. There's a wonderful picture of COVID-19 and how it affects African Americans. And it's a toxic storm. In New Orleans, we call it a gumbo. It's a mixture of different conditions, but it leads to a high degree of devastation and inequity in the Black community. This mixture, this gumbo, is related and compounded by many of the difficulties that African Americans now undergo, and it extends beyond simply looking at the cardiovascular risk factors. So in the interest of time, I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to go much further. If you do want to get some of my writings as it relates to that, I did do an editorial with a young lady out of George Washington named Samara Nasser, and we called COVID-19 a sentinel events. The Joint National Committee uses that term for hospitals. If a hospital has people who are falling and breaking their hips, they operate on the wrong patient, they leave sponges, then they really look at those patients because those sentinel events are a sign that that hospital has poor quality. And what I suggested in my editorial, this was written in the Journal of American Cardiology, you should be able to get it if you just Google my name and COVID-19 will pop up.
That we, nephrologists, internists, even cardiologists, we think we know what's happening, but we depend upon the pathologist as the final word of diagnosis. Dr. Mitchell, in your position, what do you see happening with this disease, COVID, especially for people with COVID?
Well, thank you, Dr. Maxey, Dr. all the other physicians and healthcare providers. It's good to be back on. It was on last week, and we covered a good amount of content as it relates to the George Floyd case. Talked a little bit about COVID, and I would say this again, you all, that COVID is real. From a pathology standpoint, this move to ban law enforcement. So I suggest that all of us look and consider what that means in your community. What does it mean to not have law enforcement or have a decreased force law enforcement? What does it mean to have increase within community where law enforcement is decreased, whether it's in the social services provision, whether it's in the outreach provision that law enforcement has been doing in much of community, whether it's supporting athletic leagues that law enforcement has been doing. These things, if we are going to decrease law enforcement, are things that we're going to have to do as community to engage ourselves. And so with the defunding of law enforcement comes an increased responsibility of community towards our sovereignty and towards our freedom, if that makes sense. So I want us to start thinking about that, because if you are active in your community, this is going to come up. It's coming up in my community. It's going to come up in many communities. What it means, or how do we support decreased resources going to law enforcement? We should not allow for our policymakers to get away with, if they're going to decrease law enforcement, then they need to be increasing other areas. So what are those other areas that we want to see increased, whether it's mental health, social services, parks and rec, whatever it looks like in your community that can serve to be violence prevention related activities in your community. And then lastly, I want to point you to when we're talking about police reform and you're intending for yourself to be, you're intending for you to be responsible citizens when you're making your recommendations. Please go to the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF, Police Executive Research Forum. This is a group of high-level law enforcement officers that meet on a regular basis to develop policy surrounding policing. And they've come out back in 2014, a list of 30 guiding principles for use of force. And they're pretty substantial. They're really good. I'll put it in the chat. But the first one is the sanctity of human life should be at the heart of everything an agency does. So this is coming from a law enforcement organization that supports law enforcement. And the first thing that they say is that human life should be at the heart of everything that an agency does. So it already starts off in a good space. It doesn't speak to race at all. So there's some things that need to be done here, but there's things that it is good in it that will allow for you to have a basis of information when you're engaging your policymakers surrounding what policing will look like in your community. So Dr. Maxey, I'll leave it there and answer any questions. I'll be on the call as long as you would have.
Thank you very much. I want to bring Dr. Ron Bailey, but I want to pose a question to him as we go. I recall there was a great African-American philosopher who had the opportunity to pay a visit to a prison in Northern California. I think it was called Corpus. And when he came out, he made a very profound statement. It was, thank God we have prison. Why do I say that? That was Richard Pryor. For about 4 years during my house staff in Harlem, I worked at Rikers Island. And it was a training ground for learning how to be a better criminal. Guards, the police, were more crooked than were the prisoners. And they put our young people in there for very minor offenses. and they teach them how to commit even more grievous offenses. So the question I have to Dr. Bailey as he presents, one, what do we do in this time of hazard, even though we know there's unfair police brutality to protect especially our young kids and our old people? Now they're slamming 75-year-old men to the ground. What is it that we can do while this is being solved not to provoke an unnecessary attack? What do we do to protect ourselves from police brutality until we can turn around where we have police that are from our communities? What do we tell our young kids, our sons and our daughters, so that they are less at risk until we can turn this situation around? Dr. Bailey.
Yes, so Dr. Maxey, thank you very much for having me. I, like Roger, been on the last few weeks and really learned a lot. So thanks for including me, I think, in this ongoing group, and have known and admired Keith Ferdinand for a long time. So very happy to see him today and hear of much of his recent work in this area. We all, I think, have our hands full, trying as best we can to understand fully these dual pandemics, if you will, that are out there occurring in our lives and our society and in our own area. Trying to find answers. That typical question has been posed to me pretty regularly here of late. You may know, I'm not sure if it's stated yet on this discussion this morning, that they found a young African man hanging from a tree near City Hall, not in LA, but close to LA here recently. My phone was ringing off the hook this morning about that issue, and does that bring forth additional causes of concern and fear in a variety of communities? And I think fear really is the driving construct. And that, I think, does move many of us to action. There were been marches in Los Angeles now every day for the last 2 weeks, which is good. Hopefully we actually bring, I think, attention to bear, and hopefully that'll lead toward action to limit some of the specific concerns that are adverse to our community. The limits of chokeholds, for example, is a very pragmatic, very actionable deliverable that we all seek to pursue. I think your question was a bit more parenthetical, and I think rightly so. People want to be safe. That's the whole construct of this business. I like some of Roger's recent comments that speak to police organizations stating that the sanctity of life is important for everybody, and our safety is important for everyone, African groups and others as well. It goes without saying that in a time, I think, of upheaval, and we're having that, whether it's good or bad, versus should, I think, take more employ more strategies to enhance their safety. I've got a 22-year-old son myself, a 23-year-old son, and I share with him literally on the discussion today, be very mindful of where you go and when. It may be best to go places in groups in certain settings, or you wonder what to get to have that conversation in 2020, but we do. This is the time we're in, and the relative level, I think, of, I called it upheaval earlier, it can actually be chaotic for some, can lead to bad actions by some. As psychiatrists I've seen throughout my life, very often these times bring out the worst in persons who may already be marginal in their thought processes and marginalized by society. They're often the very persons who kind of hang on to, these tenets of, whether it be white male supremacy or the belief that change is bad, or that new movements, be it affirmative action, be it, women in the workplace or the like. Those things take away some of the power and resourcefulness and fiscal strength that they may have had. Those often can be individuals and groups that can create harm and danger to others. I don't mind sharing with this group on your discussion today. I literally was writing a piece yesterday, and I shared the aspect, I think it's happened like 10 or 20 years ago, where a young man named James Byrd in Jasper, Texas, had a conflict with 3 men in that area. And, they put a noose around his neck and drove down the street and decapitated him. I got an international attention. Hopefully some of your listeners today will remember that. Where I grew up, about 8 miles where that actually happened. So friends then called and talked about it a lot. I wrote this piece yesterday. First, kind of called them and asked me, do I feel safe? Clearly, I grew up there, so it's hard to argue that every moment of my life was unsafe. But I think we all are being increasingly aware now of a greater degree of risk that may exist now, may have always existed, we learn to live with it and learn to understand and appreciate it. There were times when many persons would not go places by themselves or not be out after dark, for example, in certain areas, certain regions with limited safety and security maneuvers in place. I think that probably is a reasonable thing to discuss now, certainly some of I think of the unreadiness that we experience. I think that psychiatry, these concerns, Dr. Maxey, are akin to much of the disinfectant activity we're using with COVID-19. Many of us now are using more Lysol and disinfecting counters. And in my hospital, we probably always should have worn gloves and masks. We've always been around patients that have a higher risk of exposure and transfer of droplet varied viral material, what have you. And there's a great deal of hand-to-hand touching in the psychiatric hospital, more so than a different type setting. So we're probably engaging now in employing some strategies to limit exposure and risk. We probably always should have done. Those are really my thoughts for today. I think we should use common sense. We should probably employ more protective measures really throughout. Some types on the physical side, think about the virus and gloves and masks and protection. Other side, I think psychologically, to limit your risk of exposure to things that you really can't handle or having great difficulty with. I think that a higher suspicion is key and very relevant always, but especially during these more turbulent, more potentially chaotic, and more at-risk times. I'll stop with we can just discuss them.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey. And I know on the phone call we usually have some fairly high-ranking military people. I'm going to give you a question to ponder while we go to our next speaker. And that question is, Dr. Bailey just mentioned that we protect ourselves from the virus. We talked about that on every call. We're in gloves, disinfectant, once encountered. It occurs to me if you're in Afghanistan or Vietnam or any other dangerous place, such as California, New York, Louisiana, Atlanta, you protect yourself from law enforcement. It occurs to me that if a soldier's out on patrol, I don't think they send them out one at a time. They go in a small group. So later in the call, I'm going to ask a few of the military people to talk about protecting your loved ones and families in a hostile environment. I'd like to bring on Dr. Jesse Siraj, an epidemiologist, infectious disease specialist, and has had a lot of experiences with viruses. And I know that we're opening up the country in terms of businesses, schools, and daycare. Dr. Siraj, can you address some of your concerns concerning what's going on with the infection rate, case fatality rate, and what's going on in the country now from your standpoint? Dr. Siraj on? Okay. She was on earlier.
She's still here, Dr. Maxey. She's still here. I think she needs to unmute. Dr. Sherrod, can you unmute your device, please? We'd love to hear from you. There you are.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, everybody. I want to commend the previous speakers on the valuable information that they gave. And I guess the question now is we are getting ready to go back into the workforce. How do we protect ourselves? How do we continuously protect ourselves? I think that it's important, and I kind of mentioned this the last time, but I didn't tell you that you have a right. You need to be aware of your rights as a worker in any setting. That includes healthcare workers or any type of worker, essential workers and all, because the workplace is supposed to be safe. You have the right to work in a safe workplace. And if it's not safe, you have OSHA, which is responsible for the safety of employees, to complain to. And so you can put in an official complaint if you feel your work spot or your workplace is not safe. So be aware of, the same basic principles that we utilize for protecting ourselves on the outside are also going to be utilized for protecting yourself on the inside. So the regular PPE, the mask, if you're a healthcare worker, you know you need an N95 mask. Hand washing cannot be overemphasized because hand washing is actually the most effective method of infection control. And hand washing with soap and water, let me emphasize. The sanitizers are okay if they have greater than 60% or 6% or greater content of alcohol, but the best cleanser is soap and water because of the action of the soap and its ability to disrupt the viral cell membrane. So there's no better hand washing than hand washing with soap and water. Disinfecting surfaces is also very important because we tend to put our hands on handrails, countertops, and whatever, and then we touch our face. And that is one way of massively transmitting the virus through contact. The primary mode of spread, we know, however, is from respiratory droplets. And that's why it's important for you to have your mask when you're in public, when you're in close contact with others. And the distance is 6 feet. The distance of six feet determines our existence. And that actually has to be taken in quotation marks because we have many studies out there now showing that by talking loud, coughing, and sneezing, that the virus actually goes much further than 6 feet. So 6 feet is, I think, a reasonable distance, but if you can be further away, especially if you're encountering loud talking or singing, like you don't want to sit on the front row of the church if the choir is singing. Make sure you have your mask on if you are up there. But those are just some of the regular things. And then the personal protective equipment is also very important for protecting your body and keeping from getting the virus on your clothes and contaminating your skin and all with the virus. The main entrance seems to be through the respiratory tract. However, as one of the previous speakers said, you can also get infected through your eyes. So you have to be very careful and very conscious of using your hands and rubbing your eyes or rubbing your face and all of that. Now, I always like to go through the 3 things that are very important in any infection. And that is, there are 3 important things that determine whether you get infected or not. And the first thing is the status of your immune system. It's the status of the immune system of the host. The second thing is the amount of virus that you're exposed to. So that's called the viral load, or the amount of virus that you come in contact with, and the amount of virus that actually gets on you or in your body or into your respiratory passages. And then the third thing is the virulence of the organism. And we know that COVID-19 is quite virulent. And we can see that in the mortality that it's creating, not only in the United States, but around the world. So we also, when we get ready to go back to work, we need to make sure we boost up. And I like to use that word boost up. I heard another commentator say, well, what is boosting up the immune system? You need to sleep and get good exercise and eat right, and then you're okay. Well, eating right is a major challenge in America with the standard American diet called SAD. So we do need to be very conscious of what we're putting in our mouths. But there are some other things that you can do to improve the function of your immune system and actually maybe prevent you from getting infected. And that is vitamin C, 1 gram to 2 grams a day. The other thing is vitamin D, and there have been articles printed recently on the excess deficiency of vitamin D in the African American population. So that's another thing you need to, 1, get a vitamin D level, because if you take too much vitamin C, you can actually get toxicity from it. So if you have a vitamin C level less than 20, you're severely deficient. You want to be between 40 and 50 if you have no other underlying pre-existing conditions. If you have underlying pre-existing conditions, it's good to keep your vitamin D level up around 70. 80 is the max. You don't want to get above 80. And drink plenty of water, like half your body weight in water every day. Walking is the most effective form of exercise that you can do for your cardiovascular system and also for your immune system. So you want to get sleep, and that's 8 hours of sleep. And if you get to sleep before 10 o'clock, between 10 and 12, that counts double. So if you sleep between 10 and 12, it's like getting 4 hours of sleep as opposed to going to bed at midnight. And so those are some of the things we can do to boost up our immune systems. And then remember your precautions: the mask, the personal protective equipment, the hand washing, not putting your hands on your face, and the sanitizer. When you're in the grocery store and you pick up stuff, you can just quickly sanitize with that. But hand washing is the most effective method of infection control. And while I have the floor, I wanted to just ask a question, because this policing is really very a major concern of mine. And I think there's a misinterpretation, and maybe I'm just hearing it differently, but I don't think anybody wants to not have any. I think what we want is effective policing, and we want police to do what they are trained to do. So we got two issues here. One, they're given responsibilities that they shouldn't be doing. So the defunding of the police department means transferring those activities that are not related to policing to the proper disciplines, like mental health, like domestic violence. All of that can be handled through other agencies. And I think it was President Reagan who actually, got rid of all the mental institutions. And a lot of the people who are out there on the street now are homeless because they're mentally ill. And police are dealing with them. And many have lost their lives. So we have to get the funding for the right disciplines in our communities, and then develop proper guidelines for policing. Because right now, it just doesn't make any sense to me for somebody to lose their life over $20 or over jaywalking. I mean, this is senseless. It's inhumane. And, I was in Cuba. The police in Cuba don't even carry guns. So you can get to the spot. I think it's all about what we intend to do. And the intention, policing came out of a bad intention. And that's what has been continued in this country. The intention of using the police to get the free slaves and get them back into slavery. And that's how our police department has evolved. So we have to root out the racism, the structural racism, and get some good guidelines in for our policing. And that involves community policing.
Thank you,
Dr. Mack.
Yeah.
Briefly, Ron Bailey mentioned earlier, I knew Keith Ferdinand from 25 years ago when I was in New Orleans, where he was then as well. And the last speaker's comments just ring a bell. I had the contract as the forensic faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry to do pre-evaluations of the New Orleans Police Department for the 2-3 years that I was there. And I've been discussing this for several years, for 20 years really, and good medium to kind of discuss it today. Hey, I walked away from that experience thinking, wow, how shocked I was at the types of persons who actually went for the police department. They got like a pre-employment psychological before they could even qualify to get into the training subscript to become a policeman or the academy. Secondly, I think I also walked away struck by what people would actually tell me. You think that generally persons try in psychiatric evaluations, any kind of evaluation, put their best foot forward and only say the really good things about themselves, or kind of hide or mask the adverse thoughts and that they have or behaviors they've been involved in. Very often it was not my experience versus going for the police department. We heard some of the most vile things from individuals who were going for the police department. So not surprisingly, over the last 20 years, we see these kind of things on television, people who, as a group, so many, my experience was really started off with remarkably negative intentions, remarkable biases toward other groups, especially ethnic minority groups. And very often I found, my third and final point, often the persons who were easily influenced. So I'm not surprised at all by the so-called code of blue. this idea that there's group think or group mentality, and a person trying to circle the wagons and protect themselves. These tend to be some of the exact type things that would be adverse in a setting where you need policemen to police themselves. And for one person saying to somebody else to say, stop doing that, don't do that, let's go for another, let's use another way. There's a lot to be said in this regard, but this is probably more of a systemic problem nationally, I think, Dr. Maxey, than otherwise. This idea that we really need a very different type of person wanting to become a policeman. So I really appreciated 2 weeks ago when you had me on this call and one of your speakers said we need more African Americans in general even try to be policemen. A lot of value, I think, in that line of thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. I'd like to have some questions from the floor of our speakers, Ms. Imani Gibson, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Ferdinand, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Sherrod are here for questions. I'd like to, Sheldon Simon, if you could, have any questions in the chat box.
Hi, there is a statement that says, I would like for him to share with the group his definition of racism, tenets of racism, and everyday changes we can make to subdue a racist when we meet them. And I believe that was for Dr. Ron Bailey.
Dr. Bailey?
Very briefly, I'm going to share, I just wrote about this. I wrote a piece on it, got respectful racism, literally just yesterday. I'm going to give this around to Max, maybe pass it out to going forward. But in a few words or less, I'd say that racism is based, in my estimation, on this idea that there's a strong belief, although we stopped short of calling it a psychiatric diagnosis or delusion now, of one's superiority within the context of what we call white supremacy, superiority over other individuals, simply because of race. Now, very often it has implications that are promulgated in these various institutions of life, health and education and academics and finance and the like. The big issue very often is, I think, in the legal setting, that is very often is used, I think, to disenfranchise persons who are of a different race. One thing I like to often share, though, is that although we see it primarily, I think, in most foul ways against African Americans, we've been speaking a lot, I think, in contemporary times about the fact that other groups are also likely to be at risk. What you see in some settings, when you get rules or laws that actually prevent the mistreatment of one group, very often, I think, the aggressors, dominant group, will move, I think, in a different direction. So we should be mindful of that, I think, going forward. The issue of superiority based solely on race really speaks to the gist of the idea of a racist ideology.
Thank you so much for that.
Well, Doctor, can I just ask another question, Dr. Bailey? Last week you gave us 4 things in your definition of a racist, I guess is the word, because, they like to say that this is reverse racism, and you actually have to be able to influence large groups of people in order to be a racist, quote unquote. So can you just repeat those things you said? The 3, I think there were 4 things that you said last week that characterize.
Well, I think that the key items we discussed last week were, first and foremost, one has to be in a position of power or authority. Exactly right. The entire discussion about reverse racists, I've always thought, was off-putting by those in the so-called dominant or powerful group that are trying to change the messaging or alter the narrative, and then kind of point the finger in the other direction to those people who have been victimized and who are vulnerable. I don't think that really actually carries much water diagnostically. I think secondly, it also is irrational. And I hope that's the word I used last week. The reality is many of us who will decide that they're against African Americans when they're in a certain situation, they go to a doctor and get a and they got a great black doctor, not black anymore. All of a sudden, then he's one of them. We all know the story about Oprah Winfrey went and did a show in Texas 20 years ago, and somebody said, "Well, you're not a nigger." Sorry for using that word. Like the rest of them, somebody get across some magic threshold, and it wasn't that all blacks are automatic unless you know somebody very specifically. That issue, I think, of it being irrational was also key. The third issue is this idea that these concerns are very often learned, but they're ingrained. So persons are not born racist. That's not a great deal, but they're ingrained because there's tremendous repetitive interplay. Your parents tell you to be a racist. Your school teachers tell you to be a racist. The police tell you. The media tells you everywhere you go. And if you try early on to dip your foot in the water and try to be fair or balanced, say, well, I've got a black friend and this is the right way to be. You often can have your hands slapped metaphorically, and you're kind of forced to be in that direction. That's why it's lasted so long. It's been so adverse and so negatively impactful because it's hard to be in the middle. And that's why many people discuss a lot of the value that many individuals who are Caucasian benefit from by being involved in a process of white supremacy, because they may themselves say, I'm not individually an avowed racist. The final part, obviously, is the side that take it to the extreme and engage in violent or very deleterious or destructive acts. Those are the four key themes in trying to define racism and racist ideology and behavior, as we see it here in America today.
Dr. Ferdinand, you've had a lot of experience practicing in the South. I know you were there during Katrina and before. Would you comment on some of these issues?
Well, I agree with what Dr. Bailey's saying, but I'd like to add one different perspective. I have never actually tied racism into how people feel or what they say. I tie it into structures. So, for instance, you can have a person who really doesn't believe that they're superior, really doesn't believe that it's correct to divide people based on race. But if they benefit because they're a restaurant owner, if they benefit from having their employees work minimum wage and all you can steal, when the Super Bowl leaves, when the Sugar Bowl leaves, when Mardi Gras leaves, you tell Joe, we don't need you next week. You make sure they keep their hours less than 40 so that you don't have to pay insurance. Then those are racist acts. And it could be a quite amicable fellow. It could be, a boss everybody likes. But the structure that's set up in that particular facility in that industry is racist. Same is true with education. And of course, those of us who are doctors, we know within the healthcare delivery system. When I'm at Tulane, and I'm there because I'm from New Orleans, that's where my people go to get care. Oftentimes somebody will come from administration and they'll call me aside. They'll say, Dr. Ferdinand, we have a VIP who needs to be seen today. Can you see them? And I'll kind of chuckle and smile inside, and I say, oh yes, sure, surely, go put them on my schedule. But they don't know. I don't deal with the VIP. I don't care whether the person is Asian American or white or black. I don't care if they are vice president of some local corporation or a Medicaid patient who has no insurance or no employment. And that is kind of built into the system that we treat people differently depending on what their wallet is and depending on their station in life. So those are the type of racist structures that I really look to in order to define racism, in order to overcome racism. I think all the personal aspects of it that Dr. Bailey described are important to continue it, to keep it, to grow it. But I think eventually we're going to have to rip apart those structural inequalities in order to make a difference.
Thank you, Dr. Ferdinand. When you work for a multi-billion-dollar corporation and handle their worldwide wellness, Mr. Manning, how do you deal with and do you see racism in the platform in which you work?
So I think that's an interesting question. I think I see, I think like someone else said on the call, racism is really systemic. So I think for those of us who work in tech, which, the company that I work for would consider itself to be part of, you see that representation is really low for Black engineers. There is a lack of understanding across companies for how to hire Black talent. The recruiters, the diversity teams tend to be understaffed. When employees are, coming in new, fresh out of college, and may not have had opportunities to have mentorship before coming into their first job. They tend to kind of get lost in the structure. Those are the types of places that I see it manifesting systemically in companies like the one that I work for. And I think that right now the beautiful thing that I see happening is because of the situation and because of the climate that we're in, that's really pressured a lot of these companies to really step up how they care for Black employees, their retention, the landscape, the environment promotion for Black employees, which all of those across the board are very low in a variety of different companies that are like the one that I work for. And that's feedback I've gotten, I see in my own environment, that I see from colleagues and friends that work at other companies as well. But I do think that that's actually improving, and there's a lot of pressure now, especially with the press that bad press companies are getting for not caring for their employees and for there being things like microaggressions in the workplace that employees are experiencing, where someone's asking them a question about their hair or making an assumption about them because of the color of their skin. Those are the types of things that I see the most, and I think that is changing now because it's never been acceptable, but there's so much pressure on it not being acceptable, and a lot of the other folks who are not Black who work at the companies are taking it upon themselves to really enforce that and perpetuate it through the companies. For example, the mindfulness group at my company came out with a manifesto to fight racism. They said it's not just enough to not be racist. We have to actively be anti-racist, and putting together resources and tools for people to read and actions for them to do and having meetings about it. And so it's really beautiful to see things like that happening. So I've seen it be moving in a positive direction, actually.
Well, thank you. My observation, and I looked at what's going on for these past few weeks, and I'm really hopeful of seeing all these young white kids out marching for Black rights. And I believe that the majority of them, a significant number of them, are really positive and believe in that, and that's what's going to turn this around. On the humorous side, in going to dinner with a group of women and men, you always see 2 or 3 women get up together to go to the powder their nose. And I'm wondering if there's something in safety and numbers there, and I'm wondering if we've been blessed to have a number of high-ranking admirals and generals on the call, but we also might have some sergeants and lieutenants. I'd like to throw this question to one of the military people. What do you tell your troops when they go on patrol in Afghanistan? Should they go alone? Should we be alone in South Central or in Beverly Hills? What protocols, what common sense issues should we tell our young and old people about traveling in a hazardous time? Is Admiral Brewer, Admiral Johnson, or anybody on the phone, or Colonel Vajay, and good old Lieutenant or Sergeant or E5?
That's an Army question, but that's okay. I can handle a little bit of that since I work with the Marines. No, we always emphasize teaming in the military, and we also emphasize rules of engagement. In other words, what to do in each situation, which we are beginning to see is not necessarily the case in some of these police encounters. And we also have a strong accountability system. Hopefully, we can discuss this a little bit more in depth next week. I'm a little behind in getting my op-ed out, but one of the things that I'm going to say in that op-ed is that Chauvin, with 19 complaints, would never have survived the Uniform Code of Military Justice in the military. We would have called that a pattern of misconduct, and we would have thrown him out probably after about 2 or 3. And I also went to my police friends and said, is 17 or whatever that number is complaints in a 19-year career normal or excessive? And to a person, they said it was excessive. So you had a person who was clearly identified as a problem. In the military, we are bound, I don't care what your rank is, to basically either check you on the spot or basically turn you in. Period. It's a different mindset. And yes, we do team and we go out, and I'll defer to the colonels on exactly how that works in the Marine Corps. They call it the 3-block war. You have different scenarios in each block that you're trying to take in terms of territory.
Any other military officers on the phone that would add to what Admiral Brewer says? Let me speak about another kind of military. I have a good friend on the phone who's from Philadelphia, and when he was in high school, he had to walk on patrol in certain areas. You care to speak on that?
Well, L.A. was tough. I was superintendent in L.A., and I see Jeffrey over there. I tell him, check your private chat, Jeffrey. I wanted to holler at you. So, bottom line is, we had 60,000 gang members in L.A., a whole different environment. I'm going to address that in my op-ed piece because that was some tough stuff. We had, and that's why you can't get rid of the police, by the way, because we had to shut down schools constantly because we had people running through schools with guns and they were gangbangers, and that was tough. But when you have gangs. And a lot of this is the underground economy, the underserved. It goes back to, I'll defer to Dr. Bailey on what I'm getting ready to say here. That's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you create that environment, you're going to have crime. You're going to have people in the survival economy. You had it with the mafia when the Southern Italians came here. So all of that's just a human thing. And so these kids are basically trying to survive. And that's it. They are literally trying to survive. When you look at the looting and all that kind of stuff, that's a survival reaction. To be honest with you, they don't have. And so, but police don't care what your socioeconomic situation is when you're black. And I'm going to talk to that in my piece because I've been stopped twice as an admiral and handcuffed once, despite my credentials. It didn't matter. I was black.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Brewer, Admiral Brewer. This is a serious situation, and we definitely need to make that a matter of our next call. I've been in contact with through Ms. Tori Bailey. We've contacted the Deputy Chief of the LAPD, whose name is Regina Scott, and I believe she is agreeing to be at our next call. And as you know, we have a huge police department out here in Los Angeles, and they don't have a stellar record of treating people right, but she's a stand-up officer. We're going to welcome her. Certainly, Admiral Brewer, we're going to ask to speak. And there are several other people that we have invitations out to that we'll announce during the week. I'm going to open the floor to more questions, but I want to do a little bit of business first. If Mr. Ross Johnson is on, I'm going to ask him to paraphrase a letter that he has that I'm going to send out after this call. What we have done over the past 11 or 12 weeks is try to provide a platform for credible healthcare information. Healthcare is not just doctors and nurses, but also psychologists, psychiatrists, your public safety, and other issues that impinge upon your health. You can't separate those all out. We also need to include spiritual health, as we have talked about before. We have created a nonprofit organization that be high quality, that can put up information every week. That I know when I first started this, I was convinced all we had to do is get on the Zoom call, have a few people on the talk, but it's a major production to do, and we have retained some professional help. While we only see about several people on this call, about 45 on the Zoom call, it is being streamed on Facebook, a number of other platforms, and we've had an average of 2,000 to 2,500 people participating in the call that you're on now. So I'd like Mr. Johnson just to not necessarily read all the details, but the highlights of the letter that we're going to send out. We're asking people to be founding members to help us carry this on. Mr. Johnson?
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Maxey. I think you summarized it quite accurately. Over the last several weeks, Black Health Trust has done an exceptional job with developing the level of content and production that's currently being provided. And it's been extraordinarily helpful to a great number of people, evidenced by the responses that we've received, evidenced by those who are participating on today's call and providing the depth of information that's so well needed. What the Black Health Trust has been able to accomplish to date is certainly not merely an establishment of name and brand, but it's also taken a step forward to establish it itself as a nonprofit. In doing so, it certainly recognizes all of the persons participating on this particular call effectively as potential founding members. And in doing so, we'll seek additional funding to sustain its operation, not just for the remainder of the year, but throughout next year as well. The funding, the solicited funding will go towards production, certainly brand development, certainly marketing as well, and it would help to continue to empower Black Health Trust to share these level of discussions, as well as disseminate as much information as possible that would be helpful. So thank you, Dr. Maxey, for the effort applied to date, and we look forward to the great success of this group and the information that is of significant value.
I appreciate your summary, but near the bottom we wrote something of just about some of the planned schedule. Just highlight that real quickly, and then we'll move on.
Yes, throughout the next 2 to 3 months, we will secure the 501c3 that's currently in play. In addition to that, we will lock in the resources necessary to sustain production of this weekly call throughout the remainder of the year into next year. In addition to that, we will identify strategic partnerships so that we can advance any and every opportunity to secure grants as well as additional funding that will go towards our sustainability. And finally, funding will allow us to hire the necessary resources from an administrative standpoint to assist in planning, managing, and facilitating these discussions.
Thank you so much. And I am so appreciative of my colleagues. We've tried to bring the best doctors in America and other health consultants here. And notice I didn't say the best Black doctors. I'm talking about the best, period, the cream de la cream. And these ladies and gentlemen have given us their time on their Sunday, including Mother's Day and Father's Day, to speak to us. And I want to applaud them personally. But even more than that, we want to demonstrate to our community that we can give you information that you can trust from people that look like us, that have community love. I like what Dr. Keith Ferdinand said, that he doesn't make a difference. He's a doctor. He sees the patient. And I can tell you from my own experience that all doctors are not like that. We want physicians that literally care for you. And there's a phrase that says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Having said that, many of you will get a letter from me asking for you to be a founding member and make a small financial commitment to help us pay for the services that we need. It has grown beyond just the ability of me, a 200-year-old man, just to pull it off. I depend on help to do this. So you will get that. And if anybody doesn't think they're on my list, if you put your name and contact in the chat box. I will make sure that we ask you to join us. We have a small steering committee, most of whom are on the line now. We have a CPA who's working up with us. We have financial people, IT people, journal people to make this thing work. And my hat is off to Mr. Ross Johnson and Mr. Martin Pratt. They put together a preliminary website to have it streaming on all these sites that I didn't even know existed. And we have a steering committee that meets every Wednesday night, so people are putting their time and effort, and we want to make this work. So thank you so much. Let's open up the floor in our last few minutes for questions and comments. And if the speakers want to add anything, I certainly take my hat off to you bringing this good information. But I'd like to have the speakers comment, and also if there are questions or statements, brief statements from the listening audience, we'd like to entertain that too. Please be courteous and keep your questions short, and utilize the consultants that we have on the phone. Today, your information is free. If you call with their private office tomorrow, it's going to be $2,000.
I have a comment.
Dr. Maxey, I just want to mention, this is Dr. Tyler. I want to mention a couple of resources that I think would be really valuable, including as sources for information. One is called...
Let me first introduce you. This is Dr. Carolyn Tyler, who's a graduate of Stanford University Medical School. She's a renowned radiologist, and she also has a specialty in integrative medicine. And I have the pleasure of being a colleague of hers in Los Angeles. Go ahead, Dr. Tyler.
Thank you. I wanted to mention a couple of resources. One is called MedCram, MEDCRAM, and it's a website that's updated at least weekly on the science behind the COVID virus. And I went to it. It's very instructional, very easy to follow. You can even get CME units from it. Just a couple of things I learned from it is that, we always talk about the ACE2 receptor being involved. Well, what's most important about the COVID virus is that when it destroys that ACE2 receptor, it destroys the production of something called angiotensin 1-7. I had never heard of that before. But what that happens is that leads to superoxide, which is, reactive oxygen species. So everybody's heard of oxidation and oxidative stress. So it increases oxidative stress. And what that does is that causes endothelial cell damage. That's the lining of organs. That's the lining of the arteries in the body, as well as the lining in the lungs. So their hypothesis is that that damage leads to an increase in a clotting factor called von Willebrand's factor that increases clotting, and that's why we're seeing thrombosis in these cases. So the emphasis has been on the lungs, but everybody should remember that there's ACE2 receptors on endothelial cells throughout the body. So that can explain some of the damage that we're seeing in other areas of the body, like the heart, the thrombotic phenomenon. So that was very instructional. Another thing that was very important was about the vitamin D. And they were talking about how fructose actually inhibits the activation of vitamin D into, D125. It actually leads to an inactive form of vitamin D. And that results in an effective vitamin D deficiency. So although, we think, okay, because the melanin and everything, Black people are protected, we must have more vitamin D. We're finding out that Black people are more vitamin D deficient. And it could be because of our diets, and specifically high fructose corn syrup. So if nobody remembers anything else other than the fact that high fructose corn syrup can lead to vitamin D deficiency, that's a take-home where you can go through your cabinets, look for anything with high fructose corn syrup, including bread, including cereals, including your condiments and everything like that, and throw it out. that's what's leading to diabetes. And they're finding that the populations where high fructose corn syrup has not been restricted have a 20% increased incidence of diabetes. So that's a risk factor that we all should look for. One last thing is I want to mention the Institute of Functional Medicine. That's a source where you can go to, and they list the nutritional supplements that they have an evidence basis for recommending these supplements to resist resist the COVID virus, and it gives you the level of evidence, like what is the evidence for this, as far as preventing, as far as boosting the immune system. People had mentioned vitamin C, vitamin D, but also N-acetylcysteine, resveratrol, curcumin, and quercetin are some of the other potent nutraceuticals that are recommended. So I urge people to go to all those sites, MedScram and the Institute of Functional Medicine, and I think that'll be some valuable information to add to the repertoire. I also want to just introduce my friend Armine, Dr. Armine, to the call. She's an endocrinologist by training, and she's also an acupuncturist. And so I invited her to this call because she's all about natural medicine, incorporating as much of that as possible, and treating people holistically and stuff. And she's very avid about this whole COVID thing and the vaccine leading that it's leading towards. So I want to welcome her to the call.
Well, thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it, and thank you for inviting your guests, and you're going to let her speak. I'm going to throw a challenge to my friend Dr. Ferdinand. One about the ACE2 data, which you gave, that's extremely useful. But I usually make a statement only in jest to cardiologists. They tell me that in 1945, they took the very smartest cardiologists and they taught them to be nephrologists. And I don't know if you'll like that or not, but I'd like you to comment, Dr. Ferdinand, on what we should do with our patients that are being treated with ARBs and ACEs, angiotensin receptor blockade agents, and ACE inhibitors for blood pressure control, and how does it fit into what Dr. Powell was astutely telling us?
Okay, these will be my last comments, Dr. Maxey. Yes, the ACE2 is a receptor site for the COVID virus, and it is potentially increased when the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors increase the angiotensin 1 to 7, which is another part of the renin-angiotensin system that stimulates and upregulates ACE2. Coronal means crown, and those little spikes that look like nutty threads that comes off the structure of the virus sticks into the ACE2 receptor and it's pulled into the cells. The main cells, again, are the pneumocytes and the interstitial lining in the lungs, but it also can go into the vascular cells, which is, as the doctor suggested, could be why we see some of the coagulation and thrombosis. So technically, theoretically, yes, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors and ARBs, because they increase the ACE2 receptor, they make it easier for the virus to get into the cells. Now, if you go back to my opening remarks in which I suggested that although it's a acute respiratory distress syndrome that we have seen now evidence that it's also a vascular and a myocarditis syndrome, there are some studies, and we just published one out of Tulane doing meta-analyses of the biomarkers, the cardiac biomarkers like troponin and CPK. It indicates that those are a greater marker for death than anything else, that if you draw blood, the patient has a lot of those biomarkers, that vascular damage predicts death. So let's go down to the question is, what do you do about it? Because the ACE inhibitors and the ARBs upregulate the ACE2, you would think that they would be harmful. But looking at the Chinese populations and even here in the United States, you can't say that based on just observation. Calcium channel blockers don't do it, and they clearly are better blood pressure in terms of not upregulating ACE2. But there's really no proven data, just looking at patients, that if they're on an ACE inhibitor or
on ARB, that causes more death or disability. The Heart Failure Society of America, American College of Cardiology, and American Heart Association have a publicly available position paper, and they suggest that patients stay on their ACE inhibitor or their ARB if they have a compelling indication like heart failure, chronic kidney disease, or if they're post-myocardial infarction. I probably would not just take a person off angiotensin-converting enzyme inhibitor or ARB, but people who have low renin hypertension, which is a lot of African Americans, if it's just blood pressure that you're treating, you're not treating heart failure, kidney disease, the calcium blocker is probably better. That's amlodipine, tridipine, nifedipine. The pines are probably better for blood pressure.
Dr. Ferdinand, let me ask you one more question before you got to go. There was an article some years ago, quite a few years ago, saying that to adequately treat high blood pressure below the side effect profile, it takes anywhere from 2 to 4 medications. Is that still the case, or do you prefer to treat patients with high blood pressure with as few medicines as possible?
I'm not an anti-medicine person. We've done the placebo-controlled trials. It started with the VA cooperative trial in the 1960s, in which they had patients who had significant hypertension, systolic blood pressures in the 160, 170 range, and half of them were put on medicines and half were put on placebo. Half that were put on placebo, within 2 years, most of them were dead or had heart attacks and strokes. And this idea that medicines are inherently bad, I'll give you the little riff I give my patients. We're human beings. We have free will. We're not simple animals. God gives us the ability to modify our environment and make changes. Medicines can all have side effects, but at the same time, they may have beneficial effects. So if you look at the guidelines and in real practical cases, most patients are going to need 2 or 3 medicines. Now, if they were eating right, vegetarian, exercising, mindfulness, normal body weight, no stress, no smoking, maybe they could decrease medicines. But at the same time, a person brings in a car with an alternator and a fan belt that's slipping and low on oil, you're not going to tell that patient just wash the car and put turtle wax on and make it look pretty. You got to really do something for that car. So I am not against medications, and I think that the data indicates to control blood pressure and decrease cardiovascular outcomes. I know you're a nephrologist and you've seen it. It takes 2, 3, sometimes 4 medicines. It's just how you give them, which ones you give, what side effects, especially for black men, sexual dysfunction, the fatigue, the weakness, electrolyte imbalances. I mean, it takes a little effort, but still you need medications. You need medications, multiple medications.
Well, I thank you for taking time out of your busy day, Dr. Appreciate it very much. I shall see you later.
Dr. Maxey?
Yes.
This is Lamont Gibson. As a pharmacist, I have to stand with Dr. Keith Ferdinand's comments. It's incredibly important that we all get good information on the medications, number one. And number two, we must practice very careful vigilance on the side effects, on the drowsiness, on the ED, on all of the impact that the medications make. And we need to document them. Too many times patients do not write down their questions or issues or problems that they have with the medication. You can discuss these carefully with your PCP, with your specialist, whatever that problem happens to be, and you can end up having much better outcomes. Sometimes it may take 2 medications. Sometimes it may take more. But I stand with Dr. Ferdinand. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring up one other question here myself. I had a patient just the other day who stopped all of her antihypertensive medicine, all of her anti-lipid medicine. And I said, why did you stop your medicine? Why didn't you call me? Well, Ms. Jones, my friend, said that her friend told her that I shouldn't take this medicine. I said, well, what medical school did she go to? And I want to emphasize that before you stop or change your medication, you should at least talk to the person who wrote that prescription for you or somebody who has trained it. I'm not saying you shouldn't stop it, but you should seek professional advice. There's some medications that have to be stopped in certain ways. You just can't stop it. For example, there's a medication called clonidine or Catapres. It can effectively give you uncontrollable high blood pressure if you just stop it. You have to detox it down. So you want to make sure that you get the correct advice and not just do what a friend says that has no knowledge. Are there any other? Yes.
Yes, Dr. Maxey, this is Thurston Bilal. I agree with you absolutely. I deal with this all the time in clients that I have that ask me should they stop taking their medications while we're detoxing and cleansing. And I always tell them that you have to consult with your doctor. And if you want to stop taking a medication, you should get a plan together with your doctor. I, as an herbalist, know that we all need a doctor. And if you work together with your doctor and your doctor is on the same team, along with you cleaning up your diet and cleansing and nourishing yourself with herbs, then with the doctor's help, you can decrease the medication and maybe get off of the medication. But I agree with you. I concur.
I appreciate that. Certainly, and you're a very respected person.
Dr. Maxey.
Yes.
Dr. Maxey, if you would, please add to the conversation the white paper that you developed years before you and I talked about the importance of pharmacogenetic testing, because not every person absorbs medications at the same rate. And I think that has to be a very instrumental part of recommending or prescribing medications. Also, I found it very encouraging that a young sister, recent grad, has engaged with Webster Dictionary and has gotten their commitment to rewrite their definition of racism to include systemic racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will put that information out for publication. It was referring to a paper that I co-wrote with several other people, published in the NMA Journal on more in the area of precise medicine. There are genetic differences in the way we metabolize medication between ethnic groups. So we're all created equal under God, but not equal in our metabolism. Are there any other questions? People who haven't.
Dr. Maxey, there's one question in the chat concerning influenza vaccine and whether there's been some data showing that people who contract the coronavirus have an increased reaction to the virus if they've had the influenza vaccine. And I've heard some data on that, but I'd like to maybe do a little research on that, and we can talk about that next week. But I think it's a very important question because we'll be coming up to the flu season in the fall, and a lot of people are concerned. So we need to vet the information on whether vaccines put you at a risk for a more extensive or intense reaction to the coronavirus.
And I'd also like to announce that Dr. Sherrod, we've asked you and Dr. Gibson, who's a doctor of pharmacy, and one or two others to serve, along with Dr. Cecil Motley, some of our AI people, to come up with a scale by which we can judge companies that are producing these vaccines, of which are likely to do good work and we can believe in more or less. So that fits right in with, we respect the fact that you've sat with the CDC and their FDA, and we have a lot of experienced people, so I thank you for graciously accepting that responsibility that we have for our community. Are there any other comments, questions?
Dr. Maxey, there is a question. It says it's a medical-related question. How similar is COVID-19 to SARS with similar demographics of African Americans with Saudi Arabia and Africans? I believe it's a comparison. we're asking what's the comparison.
Dr. Sherrod?
Yeah, see, SARS, the coronavirus is really a group, it's a large group of viruses. And the SARS one, the COVID-19 that we are experiencing now is actually SARS-2. And the SARS stands for SARS-2. It's systemic acute respiratory distress syndrome. That's what that means. But it's caused by a coronavirus that was less virulent than the COV-2 that we're experiencing now, coronavirus 2. So it's in the same family as COVID-19, but COVID-19 is much more virulent than SARS-1 was, which was the 2003, I think, epidemic that occurred in the world. So we had SARS, which is systemic acute respiratory distress syndrome, and then we had MERS, which happened in 2009, which was the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome. So they are all in the same family, but this particular coronavirus, they're all coronaviruses. We got SARS and then SARS-2. SARS-2 is the one that we're experiencing now, which is called COVID-19. So it has become more virulent, and that's a big question in itself. They're saying that it came from a bat and all of that, but looking at some of the data and the evolution of viruses, there are questions about what has happened to this virus, that the evolution of this virus from SARS back in 2003 has not been a natural evolution. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Dr. How are you? This is Bill Relaford.
Oh, Dr. Relaford.
Hey, how you doing? Great.
Good. How are you?
How do we deal with the conspiracy theories? All of us on this call, we're pretty knowledgeable, but the people we deal with every day, they talk about is this population control? Was this made in a laboratory? And all of these really wild and crazy theories. And I think for the everyday people that we deal with, there's a lack of a trusted source or portal where people can go to and get real information. And as a result, we have all the conspiracy theories. They beat us to the punch, and they have sometimes a bigger megaphone than we do. And that's what I deal with every day in my office.
That's a very extremely relevant question. Let me address it in this way. We have another call that we call the Select Round Table. And that table is made up of not only physicians, but scientists, military people. I'll call them, some of them spooks, and I mean ethnic spooks. Statisticians, artificial intelligence people, and we started with that very point in mind to find out, was this SARS-19, was COVID-19 a purposeful set of events aimed at a set of people? Was it something artificially created? And these are people who have worked in Class 4 labs, who have developed laser systems, but, a lot of things like that. And we came to the conclusion that we don't know yet. But in the meantime, just a moment. But in the meantime, we do need to develop a source of credible information in a way to get data that is raw, so we can make up our own mind as to what is true, what is not true, and how to put it out. Thus, this call developed in the Black Health Trust, so we can have trusted physicians and scientists and public health people bring information as it's created to the floor. Now, there are always going to be some conspiracy theories, and my statement on that, just because I'm not paranoid, doesn't mean everybody's not out to get me. But conspiracy theories happen when there's a lack of credible information. We're trying to provide that platform here, and we're developing that. We have the website that's been developed. We're adding content to it. I've asked a number of my colleagues to join me in that, and you certainly are one of them. And we don't know everything yet. And so, but we can't comment on everything. For us just to put out theories ourselves, we'd be buying into the madness that's out there. As our calls progress, we're going to have some extremely interesting speakers, some of whom are controversial, very controversial. But we want to bring the information to the table, but that's a very good point. We want to unravel as much as we can and present it to our people. We're also developing a service, which will be primarily physicians, where you can call them or contract with them to get a consultation on a medical case. My own daughter-in-law has had a serious set of strokes, and I've contracted with these doctors to give me advice on what to do next. So all of those things are coming. Who was asking to speak this a minute ago?
Hi, Dr. Maxey. Thanks you so much for inviting me to this call. I just wanted to say a few things, and you already addressed the first thing that I was going to say. It's important to teach our patients and our children and everybody we know about propaganda interpretation and how to understand fact from fiction. I also wanted to say that young lady's name is Kennedy Mitchum, and we should all know her name and celebrate her for changing the definition of racism in a major dictionary. That's an amazing feat, and she really should be celebrated. I also wanted to echo Dr. Carolyn's comments about nutritional supplementation and the use of integrated medicine. Not only do I give my psychiatry patients, psychiatry, the unrecognized primary care specialty, vitamin D, because theoretically, I'm not aware of any research on that. Because of our melanin, we don't always absorb the sunlight as fully as possible, particularly if we haven't developed our melanin to stage 4. And also the use of zinc, which is inexpensive and readily available in terms of its protection against viral infection.
But you bring up something that's very interesting, and I'm going to ask Dr. Bailey to come back. First of all, I'm very concerned that it's hard to get many of our people to have a psychiatric consultation because the first word is, I'm not crazy. And many of them don't understand that psychiatry is not just for crazy people. It's for people who have issues of thinking, issues of thought, issues of mentation. And we all have anxiety, and we all can enjoy someone who's professionally trained to lead us through resolving issues. So we'll ask for comments on that later. But first, if the endocrinologist with Dr. Tyler is still on, I'd like to ask a question concerning, I know as an endocrinologist that there's a different level of bone density in African Americans. We know that the standard level of parathyroid hormone, which helps control the metabolism of the calcium and magnesium and phosphorus in the body, is different. And we have something in renal medicine that tells us we should keep the parathyroid hormone level at a certain number. If you do that in African Americans, you create bone osteodystrophy and can actually lead to their death. I wonder if you comment on the vitamin D factor, the difference in parathyroid hormone and bone density in blacks. Dr. Tyler, is she still on with us?
I don't know if she is.
Okay.
But there's another question that came up in the chat, Dr. Maxey, about quercetin and some other supplements. And the question is, can you tell us more about the use of quercetin and if we should be eating the foods, berries, green tea, etc., or taking the pill? And I think I can answer that particular question, and that is, you have to remember that the American diet the farming techniques in the United States has depleted the soil of minerals, and that is actually was discovered back in 1936 in U.S. Senate 264. You can look it up. They have not changed the farming techniques. At that time, Dr. Northern testified before the Senate and said that the farming techniques was depleting the soil of minerals. And so even if you eat organic, you're still not getting all of the micronutrients that you need for your body. So it's always important to, one, try to get the levels measured and supplement as needed, because you're definitely starting at a deficit in America because of the way food is produced in America. And even if you're eating organically, you're still missing some of the micronutrients.
I'm going to go back to Dr. Michelle Clark. Dr. Michelle, I have an eye disorder, and I just changed the colors on my machine so I can see who's what. Dr. Michelle Clark is a physician who graduated from Columbia University. Back when I was a Cub Scout, she's a renowned psychiatrist who's used to practice in Southern California, is now in Northern California. And the issues of psychiatry in Black patients are legend. And I have severe problems getting consultations. First of all, the psychiatrists left Southern California. Maybe the workload was too high. But how do we address our people that do need those that for us primary care doctors that you are one of?
I think the most important thing is to capitalize on the relationship that the patient has with you, because their trust in you is what's going to allow them to accept. Also let them know that crazy is really nothing but an insult. It's a non-medical term. And psychosis is, primary psychosis, as in the schizophrenia spectrum, is relatively rare. And the major thing that we treat are anxiety, particularly in Black people, post-traumatic slavery syndrome, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and depression. And to have them understand the difference between grief and depression, and to provide them with literature, particularly video literature. That's why this group that you put together is so critical and so important. I've already learned a bunch of things today, and been stimulated to look into some more things. So thank you very much again for inviting me. But capitalize on your relationship with the patient and let them know that psychiatry is a real field of medicine, as I said, the unrecognized primary care field. And that, it's like dermatology. Everybody has a rash sometime. Everybody has depression sometime and anxiety, particularly us Black folks here in the U.S. of A.
Well, I'm going to push it just a little bit more. Can you talk a little bit about how neurohormones, such as serotonin and other things, affect day-to-day life?
They do it every day. You supposedly get your boost of serotonin when you wake up, and that's what wakes you up and gets you moving, gets you motivated. Stress, all of the microaggressions will suppress that or have you use it up too fast. And we do have agents to do that, but there are also natural ways to do it and doesn't require medication. As Dr. Sherrod was sharing and Dr. Carolyn was sharing, it's very important to have your personal assay done because we're a hodgepodge. We're all basically genetically mixed up, and so you can't assume that just because we are culturally Black means that our particular constellation is the same. And so we have to really test, as the brother who's a pharmacist said earlier, to know your individual needs and then to eat right and supplement correctly, so that you can boost your natural serotonin, your natural endorphins, that are stimulated by, everything from laughter to sexual activity. got to keep active in order to keep your brain working. The brain and body work together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. Are there any other questions in the chat room or from the floor?
Dr. Maxey, I just want to make a statement regarding conspiracy theories. There are many things that have been called conspiracy theories that have now been proven to be true. The fact is, they're still referred to as conspiracy theories because the majority of people still do not know the truth. And I'm talking about things that have been researched, that have been documented, that have been laid out by very reputable people, lawyers, scientists. And the only way to ferret out the truth to the extent that we can is to examine the controversies, to examine the conspiracy theories, and to see what evidence is being presented for those theories. I really hope that we go further than just accepting the narrative that we're hearing from the mainstream. This country was founded upon propaganda, and it has propagated by propaganda. And most of what we hear in mainstream media is propaganda. So we have to be smarter and take a look at what lies underneath these conspiracy theories and see if there's any merit to it. So I just hope we dig deeper.
No, I
want to say amen to that.
I think you're 100% right. And what we're going to do with people like you, Dr. Tyler, is create an editorial group that's going to be able to, with aid from artificial intelligence people and other data gathering people, to look deeply into some of these things that we need to unravel. No question about it. There's a concern that I have from a political standpoint, and I want to make sure that even though there is what we call conspiracy theory, some of which may not really be conspiracy, we want to be able to offer our people the best way to go in a time like this, because there are many things that there are bots out there. There's information. The best lie is a lie that is mostly true. So we have to be able to separate that out, like you say. So we want to do that as much as possible, and I support you 100% on that. And the only question that I won't use that word Michelle told me not to use. The only bad question is the one that you don't ask. We have to ask those questions. But I think that those of us who have some healthcare training doesn't mean you have to be a physician. We want to get together and put out our best thoughts and call it credible information. It may be credible this week, but we may have to refute it next week. But at least we have goodwill in trying to do that. Are there any other questions or comments from the floor?
Yeah, Thurston Bilal. I'd like to say just a few things. I'm going to bring it up again.
Okay. Hold on a minute before you start. I'm trying to get people who haven't spoken yet, Dr. Bilal.
Okay, no problem.
Dr. Maxey, this is Cecil.
Yes, Doctor.
Regarding the conspiracy theories that you hear, there's a very fine line between biological warfare and the medical treatment of viruses and microorganisms.
Can I hold on just a minute? Can you introduce yourself, Dr. Motley?
I'm Cecil Motley. I'm a biomedical engineer and an MD PhD. I've worked with the government for, I guess, about 43 years on various weapons and treatments and sensings of all sorts of biological situations. What I would like to just tell people is it's a very fine line between the biological research and medical applications of vaccines, etc., and what the military does as a form of warfare. But there's one thing that you can count on. Follow the biological safety laboratories, like the one in San Antonio. It has been closed to the public. It used to be available to universities and other institutions because there's not many BSL-4 laboratories available. It has been moved to Galveston, Texas, and some island off of Japan. I am very suspicious about these laboratories. Physicians and the scientists that operate them are usually extremely careful, and they have all the mechanisms to scrub these things off of you when you exit the laboratory. However, there is always a technician or some other type of personnel that will jump around the rules. And when they jump around the rules, they can very well carry that stuff outside the laboratory. So just follow where these BSL-4 laboratories are being located, and it'll give you a hint of what's going on. So you don't have to rely on conspiracy theories. Follow the laboratory. Thank you.
Would you briefly just summarize some research I know that you're doing with the new patent you've applied for, just in a couple of seconds?
Sure. Dr. Maxey, Dr. Williams, and I think we have a treatment for the COVID-19 pandemic. It is actually based on something that Trump referred to. I'm sure he didn't have any knowledge of what was going on, but he referred to it when he talked about getting UV inside of the body. I worked on ultraviolet light radiation for the last, I guess, 23 years. I hold the patents on using UV as a communications technique for submarines under the water. And I think I've got about 5 or 6 patents for warfare type things using ultraviolet. We think we've come up with a way to have the ultraviolet inactivate the coronavirus. And we're using standard medical type equipment to get the light in the airways inside of the lungs. And the whole purpose of this is to keep the person alive, get the stuff out of his lung, and while you allow the immune system and other treatments to rid him of the virus altogether. But you gotta work the lungs or they're not gonna make it. You can't breathe. That's about it. So we applied for a patent, and we've got a provisional patent for it. And now we're working, getting the funding for the clinical trials.
Thank you, Dr. Motley. Anybody who hasn't spoken yet? Anything in the chat box?
There is a statement and question in the chat box. It says, please be mindful of the fact that pharmacists are quite accessible and could be a critical resource for medication questions. And the question is, how is the work of the Select Roundtable dealing with the challenge of election year offshore issues that seem to digitally appear?
Okay. I guess I'll take that. Any other members of the roundtable want to comment on that?
The challenge of election year offshore issues that seem to digitally appear.
I'm not sure. Who asked that question? You want to ask it for, let's say, out a little bit?
This is Lamont Gibson, Dr. Maxey. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt. Actually, I'm concerned about the bots that you mentioned earlier and other digital tools that are used to interfere, particularly during election years. And what the question was intended to do was to find out how the round table intends to deal with same.
What I will do, Dr. Gibson, is invite you to a session of the round table You've met some of the members, and the reason I'm being a bit circumspect because I don't want some of those people to be accused of being seditious. But we have well-placed individuals who can get us information, that raw information, and we can analyze it. So that would be the best way to answer that. And in this group, we're not trying to be political, even though we know everybody needs to vote. You must vote. But because we're getting 501c3 status, we are not supposed to endorse or unendorse people. However, we do know that we need to go and vote. And everybody knows what I mean by that. We must be represented voting.
Thank you.
Is Tori Bailey on?
I'm on. Dr. Maxey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am, did you want me to speak on anything in particular?
Want to speak on, you're helping us put together a part of the discussion for next week with LAPD and law enforcement, and introduce who you are and what you do.
Oh boy, that could take a minute, but for the most part, I'm considered a community conduit because I'm in all factions of, I'm an elected official as far as homelessness is in CD10. But my topic this week is on policing because that's our focus. We met with the chief last week. One of the things that everyone on this call can be a part of, regardless of where you are, is massive recruitment to the department. We are almost nil to none as representatives of the police department, and we would like to change that. And that may take some hands-on doing. I see other cultures take groups of 20, and they help them with their testing. A lot of the police are not as astute as we would like them to be, but we would like to have some hands-on and take. Like 5 or 10, if we could get a group of 20, let's take them, sit them down, help them with their testing, get them through the application phase. Let's get them in there. I had speakers before when I used to run an issues forum that came out to recruit. But at the time, as Dr. Maxey has stated years back, parents would say, oh no, I don't want my child on the force. No, it's a new day. We need representation on the police force. And about 15, 20 years or so, I saw in the newspaper where they were recruiting from the South, from southern areas. But we really don't want that to reoccur. One thing, that's one thing I had addressed to the department. Also, all of us should also know how to be stopped by the police. And I mentioned to the police that they need to know how to stop us. So, you know, such things as reach for nothing without letting the officer know. First tell them, you know, who you are in the role in the community. Messaging, there's so much. Also, I wanted to talk about, I mentioned that we met with the state controller last Thursday. The messaging of the defunding of the police department, some of that in California has gotten conflictual. They are not talking about defunding the police. They were talking about defunding that additional funds that they were given to the police department, which was $250 million or so, I believe. So they were going to take $150 million of that from them, which still gives the police department the $100 million. And as Jesse had mentioned, Dr. Schwab had mentioned earlier about the budget, the police budget can handle multiple disciplines as it stands now without that additional $100 million. It's all about how they're going to disperse it. So that's where we come in to help them realize they don't need certain things in this area, they don't need other things in others. My role for this week, we're going to meet with them again Tuesday to create a comprehensive document of the personality survey that we want 100% of all of the police department to take. So their phases and the systems that they have right now, I can see where the flaws are because I asked the chief what was their process of personality models when they come on board. what is it with the racism? How the questions analyzed, and how are the outcomes presented, and does each policeman get one in his file? So that's what I'm gonna have done for Tuesday. But more than that, oh my gosh, it's just it's so much. If you have any input or anything or any questions you'd like to ask to the police department, just let Dr. Mackey know and he'll relay it to me.
You're on the oversight board of the police, is that correct?
Advisory. I'm on the advisory board. So when we led the protest march last week, I called them together first before we even took a step. And they have a new police chief in Southwest Division I had not met because of the COVID. And so he actually came out too. So we got a chance to meet with 8 of the officers. I debriefed them on what we were doing before the march. And I had talked to 4 of them on the phone that prior Thursday. So what we wanted, so that's the gist of my week.
Thank you so much. I want to ask a question. We're winding down on time. We have got to get off this call. But I'm not making a statement for or against, but should Black people have arms? I know certain political parties want to get rid of guns, but I live in a neighborhood where everybody white has multiple guns.
Oh, yeah.
Should we tell everybody we know, go and get guns? I bet you that will change the gun laws real quick. Any comment?
Absolutely.
Guns.
Yeah, I think
absolutely. Yes. We should absolutely get a gun, and we have to have weapons. We cannot be the only one without weapons, and we need to be trained on how to use them. Take a class. If you need some information, I know somebody that does some training. I just bought my queen a gun this week.
I brought my queen some guns too. I just hope she don't point them at me.
That's always an issue. That's always an issue, but I'd rather for her to have it than not have it.
Okay. Let's go around and ask a few more questions before we close off. Any comments? Anybody, military people or former military people, want to comment?
I think maybe we should say it's important to have the training. Because when you bring a gun into a situation, you need to, be sure that you're going to use it. Because otherwise it can be used against you if you don't have the proper training.
That is correct.
That's right.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Ron Bailey, I wrote a book about this, so perhaps Dr. Bilal, I can discuss it a little later. I don't think it's very much a hot button topic, but all I'm saying for now is I definitely do not think that everybody needs to have a gun. I think people should they legally can have one in our country, and if they would like to, if they get trained appropriately, it can be beneficial. The big point I like to make though is that many people think that by having a gun that they're safer, and the data obviously is clear against that. So what my book talks about is the fact that folks should know what the data shows. We have a very good idea of what having a gun actually does for many. But a big part of it is that many persons think that they can have a gun and not get trained regularly or go through the practice. You have to kind of go through to be able to use it when the appropriate time occurs. And that's what we often will see. That's why there often are more accidents and more people who use your gun to suicide twice as much than homicide, those type of settings. So those tend to be, I think, a lot of our problems with the persons who will get a gun and not be adequately, not just trained to use it, but also just kind of practice the circumstance. Because very often when someone needs to use it, their emotional circumstance, somebody's broken into their house, they're challenged the way they weren't expecting, an emotional overload is what I think very often makes the normative use not work correctly. I'd add that we all think we should have with the police. The police should actually be non-emotional and professional settings, and because of that, and if they were to do so, probably to have, we tend to see a policeman in our society now who are overly emotional. They're biased. They're also either they already have some antagonism or antipathy toward certain groups like African Americans, and they bring that to the equation. And therefore, the use of the gun very often is ill-advised and be a bad outcome. So, really, a lot of meat on the bone to discuss about whether people should have one or not. I think beyond having one, the other issues I think are more germane.
The question I would ask you, I'm going to later ask you who that handsome guy is behind you, but I was making more of a political statement. What would happen if everybody black went out to buy guns? Would that change gun laws?
The society is showing what they do. When the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s went to the state house in Sacramento, California with guns, all of a sudden then the NRA was against everybody having a gun. And again, the California legislature passed legislation that supported gun control. So clearly our society is afraid, I think, unfortunately, across the board of African Americans. So when we as a group have guns, it absolutely changes how society views access to guns and the like. That would be a very different political statement. I think you're right.
Okay. That's why we should have go get your gun clubs, where people can get together with groups who are going to learn how to shoot guns, and just that act alone would change things.
Yeah, I had a situation that was very emotional for me. I was in Puerto Rico, and my wife called me that the two sheriffs had come to the door. Their guns were drawn, and they warned my wife that our home was being surveilled by a young black man with a hoodie on. And they asked her to shelter in place while they went around the house with their guns out. And she said, they said, "Thank you, ma'am, for calling us." She said, "I didn't call you." "Oh my God, my son's outside working with the hoodie." They were looking to shoot my son. And I called the state police or the people up here. I said, if any white cop comes up here, I'm going to shoot him myself. Don't come on my roof. Let me take my own chance. So I know what they can do. So, comments of any new people on the line? Yes.
I just forgot to say one thing. There's a video out now that was done by the series of Hidden Colors. It's a 6-part series. So since Dr. Bailey had mentioned the superiority of white supremacy, number 4 is specifically on white supremacy. So when you get some downtime and take some relaxed time, get a chance to view that video, please.
That's good. Well, I thank everybody for being on the call. I'd like to ask my speakers if they have a last word before we end the call. Dr. Bailey, Iman, if you're on, I think Dr. Ferdinand is gone. Is Dr. Mitchell still on? And Dr. Sherrod.
I have one statement, Dr. Maxey. I did mention testing for people who are going back into the workforce. I think it's important to know your status when you go in. So I think people should get tested before they go back to work so they can know whether they're negative or positive, and then be tested frequently if they're in contact with people frequently.
Okay, now testing is now free. I understand they're testing in various places.
Yeah, they have various sites and it's free.
Okay.
What kind of test, Dr. Sherrod, and what type of test?
The nasopharyngeal test is the one that you are interested in, which is usually a PCR test detecting the DNA of the virus. The antibody test is not very useful right now unless you're trying to treat somebody who's had, used the plasma of a person who was positive or had experience with the virus, use that to kind of help another person get through the illness, then the antibody test is very important. We're still trying to figure out exactly what the antibody test means and when a person whether it's protective or not. And it is important to know that asymptomatic people do spread the virus. They think that it's spread most often, though, just pre-asymptomatic. Just prior to you becoming symptomatic is what I want to say. That period just before becoming symptomatic is probably the highest risk area for contracting the virus from another person. But asymptomatic people with no symptoms, can have the virus and spread it. And LA County's data, and I really need to call the health officer because I gave this information at my class reunion. And she had said, and she said it again, 83% of the people tested in LA County who tested positive were asymptomatic. Now, that's what I heard twice. First, she said 86%. That was last week. This week, she said 83%. So that's a really high number. So I'm going to call the public health officer and kind of verify that data. But it seems like there are a lot of people walking around with no symptoms.
And we would have that this week. Is Dr. Mitchell still on?
Dr. Mitchell had to go because he left a note in the chat. He signed off at 2 o'clock.
Okay. And,
yeah, he would be a good person to ask that because I was thinking of asking him what they've been seeing.
Okay. Is Bishop Pate on? Or Pastor Sabine Jones? Is Brenda Lieger on? Then I guess I'll have to say our prayer to get on. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the many blessings that you have bestowed on us. We thank you for the blessing for our health. We pray the grace of salvation, the sound for those of us who have lost family and friends. We ask you, Lord, to make these efforts and these calls useful, building health in our communities of color. We ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Good night, everybody. Good day.
Amen. And I couldn't find my mute button. Here's wishing everyone a great week. We're all one, and let's carry on. Do what we got to do. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for everyone joining us today, especially our speakers.